In the beginning. In the beginning of the human story, there were no countries, no races, no borders, just people. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, first appeared in Africa around 300,000 years ago. These first humans lived under intense sun, and their bodies adapted for survival. Their skin produced high levels of melanin, giving them black skin, which protected them from harmful ultraviolet radiation. So the truth is, the earliest humans were black people living in Africa. How long before humans left Africa? Humans stayed in Africa for a long time, over 200,000 years. Then, around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, small groups began to leave. This movement is known as out of Africa theory. These were not huge armies, just small families moving slowly over generations. They walked into the Middle East, Asia, Europe, eventually the Americas. What happened after migration? As humans spread across the world, they didn't stay the same. Through human adaptation. In areas with less sunlight, skin became lighter. In colder climates, body shapes changed. Different facial features developed over thousands of years. This took tens of thousands of years, not overnight. That's how we get the diversity we see today. Did they have religion back then? Before organized religion, early humans still had deep beliefs. They practiced things like early spirituality, before formal religion, respect for nature, belief that animals and land had spirits, burial of the dead, showing belief in something beyond life. This is often called animism. So yes, they had spiritual awareness very early, even before written religion. When did organized religion come? Much later, after people settled and built civilizations. Examples include ancient Egyptian religion, Hinduism, and later, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. These came thousands of years after migration, not at the very beginning. The core truth of Chapter 1. If you strip everything down to the facts, humanity begins in Africa. Early humans had black skin. Humans lived in Africa for over 200,000 years. Migration began around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Belief systems existed early, but organized religion came later. Final line. Before nations, before borders, before names, there were people in Africa, shaped by the sun, carrying the first spark of humanity. From them, the entire world would grow. Chapter 2: The Great Journey of Humanity. After tens of thousands of years in Africa, humanity began its biggest movement ever, spreading across the entire Earth. The same species, Homo sapiens, slowly left Africa in small groups around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. This is still part of the out of Africa theory. They weren't empires yet. They were families, hunters, and survivors moving step by step into unknown land. The first paths out of Africa. Early humans followed water, animals, and warmer climates. They moved into the Middle East, Central and South Asia, Europe, later, the Pacific regions and the Americas. This slow spread happened over tens of thousands of years, not quickly. How people changed over time. As humans entered new environments, they adapted through human adaptation. In strong sunlight, Africa, some southern regions, black skin stayed common for protection. In low sunlight, Europe, northern Asia, skin gradually became lighter to absorb more vitamin D. In cold climates, bodies adapted for heat retention. Facial features shifted slowly over generations. Important truth. These changes happened over thousands of years, not instantly. Asia, the first major settlement zone. Asia was one of the earliest and largest destinations. People moved into South Asia, India region, East Asia, China, Korea, Japan regions, Southeast Asia. Over time, they formed distinct cultures, languages, and identities. Key point: all of these groups still share the same African origin deep in ancestry, but developed unique traits due to environment and time. The first Americans, Hopi ancestors included. One of the most important migrations was into the Americas. Humans crossed a land bridge called Bering Land Bridge. This happened roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. They moved south and spread across North and South America, becoming many nations and cultures over time. Ancestors of the Hopi. Groups that would later relate to the Hopi tribe developed in the American Southwest. Their ancestors were part of broader ancient cultures like ancestral pueblos. Their life: corn farming, maize agriculture, stone and adobe villages, deep spiritual systems tied to land and sky, strong oral history traditions. They are not recent arrivals. Their roots in the Americas go back thousands of years. Latin America beginnings before modern Latino identity. Before modern Latino identity existed, the Americas already had advanced civilizations. Maya civilization, Aztec Empire, Inca Empire. They built cities, roads, calendars, farming systems. Then later came European arrival and African influence, which reshaped the region. Spirituality in the new worlds as humans spread, belief systems also developed. Early forms: animism, spirit in nature, ancestor respect, sacred land traditions. Later civilizations developed organized religions and complex spiritual systems, such as ancient Egyptian religion, Hinduism, Mesoamerican religion. Spirituality came early. Organized religion came later with civilization. Big truth of Chapter 2. If you zoom out, the story is: humans left Africa once. They spread slowly across Earth. They adapted to new environments. New cultures, languages, and identities formed. All groups are connected through deep ancestry. From one origin, humanity split into many paths, not separate beginnings, but different journeys of the same human story written across the earth. Chapter 3: Land, People, and What Actually Happened. 1. Before Mexico, Texas, Arizona, California. Long before modern borders, these lands were home to indigenous civilizations for thousands of years. Examples: Hopi tribe, Arizona region. Ancestral Puebloans. Maya civilization. Aztec Empire. Inca Empire. What they did, real life before Europeans. Food: corn, maize, beans, squash, Three Sisters farming. Hunting deer, rabbits, bison, region dependent. Fishing along coasts and rivers. Living: adobe villages southwest. Large cities, Mesoamerica like Tenochtitlan. Nomadic tribes in plains and deserts. Culture and religion. Deep connection to land and ancestors. Seasonal ceremonies. Astronomy and calendar systems. Examples of belief systems. Mesoamerican religion. Nature-based spiritual systems across North America. Important: these societies were organized, complex, and long established before European arrival. 2. European arrival, the big shift. In 1492. Christopher Columbus voyage 1492. Then Spain expanded into Mexico, Southwest U.S., California region. This created Spanish colonies, not modern countries. Later, Mexico became independent in 1821. U.S. expanded westward. 3. Where Latinos come from, important clarity. Latino is not one ancient group. It is a modern identity formed from indigenous peoples, original Americans, Spanish/Portuguese colonizers, Africans brought through the slave trade. This mixture happened mostly after 1500. 4. Texas, Arizona, California. Who controlled what? 5. Did people owe land? Historically speaking, indigenous peoples were the original inhabitants. Spain, Mexico, and the U.S. each controlled land at different times. Borders changed through war, treaties, and colonization. But owning land is not how history or international law works today. Modern borders are based on recognized treaties and governments, not ancestry alone. 6. Religion spread and change. Before Europeans, indigenous spiritual systems, nature, ancestors, sky. After Spanish arrival, Christianity spread widely. Many indigenous practices blended with Catholicism. This created syncretic traditions, mixed beliefs. 7. Big picture, this is the real story. Before 1500, indigenous nations controlled all land. Advanced societies existed across the Americas. 1500–1800s. Spanish colonization reshaped everything. African diaspora added new cultures. After 1800s, U.S. and modern Mexico formed current borders. Indigenous nations were pushed onto reservations or reduced territories. Final truth. If you strip away politics and emotion, indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of the Americas. Modern, Latino, identity is a mix of indigenous plus European plus African ancestry. Texas, Arizona, California changed hands multiple times through history. Borders today are the result of wars, treaties, and colonization, not single ownership. Were the Maya and Indians the same or friends? First important clarification. Indians, in the Americas, is a broad modern term for many different indigenous nations. The Maya civilization were one specific civilization in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Central America. Other indigenous groups, like Hopi ancestors, Apache, Navajo, etc., were different nations in different regions. So they were not one group, they were many separate peoples. Did they own the same land? Not in the modern country sense. Before Europeans, there were no borders like Mexico, Texas, or the U.S. Land was controlled by many independent nations. Examples: Maya controlled city-states in southern regions. In central Mexico, the Aztec Empire later controlled large areas. In the U.S. Southwest, Pueblos/Hopi ancestors lived in their own settlements. Plains tribes moved seasonally with buffalo. So land was shared regionally, expanded, traded, or fought over, not owned, like modern property lines. Were they friends? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Just like today, different groups. Alliances happened. Trade between neighboring nations. Marriage alliances. Shared ceremonies in some regions. Conflicts also happened. Territory disputes. Resource competition, water, farmland, hunting areas. Power struggles between empires. Example: the Aztec Empire often controlled or demanded tribute from other groups nearby. So relationships were complex, cooperation and ICT, depending on time and place. How did they live? Across indigenous civilizations. Settled civilizations like Maya. Built cities and pyramids. Advanced astronomy and writing systems. Farming-based societies. Mobile/seasonal groups, some North American tribes. Followed food sources like buffalo or deer. Lived in adaptable housing, teepees, adobe, etc. Religion and beliefs. Before European contact, the Maya had a complex system of gods, calendars, and rituals. Many North American nations, including Hopi ancestors, had spiritual systems tied to nature and ancestors. Example category: Mesoamerican religion. These belief systems were different by region, not one unified religion. Big truth about who owed what. It's important to understand. There was no single, indigenous government over all land. There were hundreds of nations, each with their own territory. Land control changed constantly through time. So instead of who owned it, history is more accurate as who lived where at different times and how did control shift. Simple way to remember it. Maya equals Southern city civilizations, Hopi ancestors equals U.S. Southwest villages. Other tribes equals plains, forests, deserts, coasts. They were all indigenous, but not one unified nation. They traded sometimes, fought sometimes, lived differently depending on land. Chapter 4: Indigenous Americas Plus. Latino Origins, the Real Story. 1. Before Latino existed, there was no Latino identity yet. The Americas were home to many indigenous nations for thousands of years, including Maya civilization, Aztec Empire, Inca Empire, Hopi tribe, ancestral Puebloans. These were independent nations, not one group. 2. How they lived before Europeans. Cities and homes. Maya stone cities, pyramids, writing systems. Aztec massive capital city, Tenochtitlan. Hopi/Pueblo ancestors, stone plus adobe villages in the desert. Food: corn, maize, beans, squash. Hunting deer, turkey, bison, depending on region. Fishing in coastal areas. Knowledge: astronomy, tracking stars and seasons. Farming systems adapted to environment. Trade routes across continents. 3. Europeans arrive, big change. Starting in 1492. Christopher Columbus voyage 1492. Then Spain expands into Mexico, Southwest U.S., Arizona, Texas, California regions. This created Spanish colonies. Forced labor systems in some areas. Cultural and religious change. 4. Where Latinos come from. Latino is not ancient, it comes after colonization. It forms from a mix of indigenous peoples, original Americans, Maya, Aztec, Pueblo, etc. Spanish/Portuguese settlers, language, Catholic religion, governance. African people brought through the transatlantic slave trade. 6. Were indigenous peoples and Latinos the same? No. They overlap but are not the same. Indigenous peoples equals original nations of the Americas. Latinos equals people with mixed ancestry, post-1500 identity. Many Latinos today do have indigenous ancestry, but Latino identity formed later through colonization and mixing. 7. Were they left out of history? Indigenous history was often undertaught or simplified in schools, but it is now widely recognized in archaeology and anthropology. Latino history, often taught through colonization plus modern nation building, not always fully connected back to indigenous roots. So yes, parts were minimized in education systems, but the full history is now well documented. Final truth, clean and simple. Indigenous nations were here first and for thousands of years. They had cities, science, farming, and complex societies. Latino identity came later from mixing indigenous plus European plus African peoples. Land changed hands through colonization, war, and treaties, not one-time ownership. The Americas began with indigenous nations. Later history added new peoples and mixtures, creating modern identities, but the original civilizations remained the foundation of the land. Chapter 5: The Origin of Indigenous Religions. 1. Where spirituality starts, before religion. The earliest humans in the Americas didn't have religion, like churches or books. They developed what scholars call animism. Core idea: everything in nature has spirit or life. Animals, rivers, mountains, wine, sun, ancestors. This belief likely formed because early humans depended completely on nature. Observed patterns, seasons, storms, animal behavior. Tried to explain life and death. 2. How these beliefs developed. As societies grew, farming, cities, calendars, spirituality became more structured. So animism evolved into organized religion systems. This happened independently in different regions, not copied from one source. 3. Mesoamerica, Maya/Aztec religion. How their religion worked. They believed the universe had cycles: creation, destruction, rebirth. Key beliefs: multiple gods, sun, rain, maize, death, etc. Time was sacred, calendars were spiritual tools. Human life connected to cosmic balance. Ritual practices: offerings, food, incense, ceremonial dances. Blood offerings in some periods, symbolic life energy. Aztec system, later powerful empire. Core belief: the world is in constant balance, and must be fed spiritually. They believed the sun needed energy to rise each day. Humans played a role in cosmic survival. Major gods: sun god, rain god, earth goddess. 4. Southwest North America, Hopi roots. Core idea: harmony with nature is everything. Key spiritual concepts: the world is alive and balanced. Humans must live in harmony, not control nature. Ancestors and spirit beings guide life. Spiritual beings: Kachinas, spirit messengers. They represent rain, fertility, guidance, moral teaching. Hopi spiritual life. Ceremonies tied to seasons. Farming rituals for rain and harvest. Oral tradition, no written scripture. 5. Where did the ideas come from? These religions were not invented suddenly. They developed from 1. Survival observation. Sun equals life. Rain equals survival. Death equals mystery. 2. Memory and storytelling. Elders passed down knowledge orally. Stories became sacred teachings. 3. Environment. Desert peoples focused on rain and balance, jungle/city peoples focused on cycles and gods. 6. How they changed over time. Before Europeans fully developed spiritual systems. Deep cultural traditions. After Europeans arrived, Christianity was introduced. Many indigenous beliefs were suppressed or blended. This created syncretism, mixed belief systems. Indigenous plus Christian elements combined in some regions. 7. What was lost/changed? During colonization. Some temples destroyed. Oral traditions disrupted. Forced religious conversion in many areas, but many traditions survived. Hopi ceremonies still exist today. Maya descendants still maintain cultural practices. Indigenous spirituality continues across the Americas. 8. Big Truths Summary. Indigenous religion started from nature plus survival plus observation. They became complex systems over thousands of years. Maya/Aztec equals structured gods plus cosmic cycles. Hopi equals balance, spirits, harmony with nature. These systems are still alive today in many communities. Indigenous spirituality did not begin in books or buildings. It began in the relationship between humans, nature, and survival, and evolved into some of the oldest belief systems in the world. Were indigenous peoples smart, and did they have governments? Yes, absolutely. Indigenous civilizations in the Americas had governments, laws, engineering, astronomy, trade systems, cities, government systems. Aztec Empire had emperors, tribute systems, and city governance. Maya civilization had city-states with rulers and written records. Hopi tribe had council-based leadership and village systems. Science and knowledge. Advanced astronomy, tracking planets and eclipses. Complex farming systems, corn agriculture, irrigation. Architecture, pyramids, stone cities. So yes, they were highly intelligent, organized societies, not uncivilized. 2. Did Columbus discover the Americas? Short answer, no. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean islands. But indigenous peoples were already living there for thousands of years. He did not discover a new world, he arrived in a world that already existed. The more accurate phrase is, he initiated European contact with the Americas. 3. How were indigenous peoples forced into Christianity? After European arrival. Step 1. Colonization. Spain and other empires took control of land. Step 2. Mission systems. Churches and missions were built. Indigenous people were often forced or pressured to convert to Christianity. Step 3. Methods used. Forced conversion in some areas. Punishment for practicing traditional religions. Removal of children to be raised in mission schools, later periods. Cultural suppression. Important, not all conversion was immediate or identical, some blended traditions instead of fully replacing them. 4. Why was indigenous history erased, or not fully taught? It wasn't completely erased, but it was often minimized, simplified, Eurocentered in textbooks. Main reasons. 1. Colonial perspective. Early written histories in the Americas were mostly written by Europeans who focused on their own arrival and kingdoms. Didn't always understand indigenous systems. 2. Destruction plus disruption. During colonization, cities were destroyed in some regions. Written records like Maya codices were lost or burned. Oral traditions were disrupted. 3. Education systems later. School systems in the 1800s, 1900s often taught European history as main history, indigenous history as prehistory or background. 5. Did indigenous culture survive? Yes, very strongly. Even after colonization, languages survived. Ceremonies survived. Governments survived. Many tribes still exist officially today. Example: Hopi tribe still practices ceremonies and maintains cultural identity today. And across the Americas, millions of indigenous descendants exist today. Many still preserve traditions. 6. Big Truths Summary. Indigenous peoples had complex governments and advanced societies. Columbus did not discover a new world, he arrived in an already populated one. Christianity was spread through colonization and mission systems, sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced. Indigenous history was underrepresented in early education systems, but not completely gone. Indigenous cultures are still alive today, not extinct. The Americas were never empty or undiscovered, they were home to advanced civilizations, whose histories were later reshaped by colonization, but never fully erased. Indigenous life in California, Texas, Arizona, before colonization. Before Spain, Mexico, or the U.S., these lands were home to many different indigenous nations, not one group. Arizona, Southwest cultures. Example groups: Hopi tribe, Apache, Navajo, Dine, and related peoples. How they lived. Desert farming, corn, beans, squash. Cliff and mesa villages, Hopi. Seasonal movement in some groups, Apache. Society. Clan systems, family-based governance. Councils of elders. Strong spiritual traditions tied to land and rain. Life was built around survival in dry land plus spiritual balance with nature. California, one of the most diverse regions. California had hundreds of tribes, not one nation. Lifestyle. Fishing, salmon, shellfish. Acorn harvesting, major food source. Hunting deer and small animals. Society. Small independent villages. Trade networks across regions. Very complex languages, dozens existed. California was one of the most culturally diverse indigenous areas in North America. Texas, plains plus desert plus coastal tribes. Texas had many groups depending on region. Examples of lifeways. Plains tribes, buffalo hunting. Coastal tribes, fishing and trading. Desert groups, nomadic survival. Society. Mobile camps or semi-permanent villages. Strong warrior and hunting traditions. Trade between regions. Important truth about all three. There were no U.S. states yet. No Mexico or modern borders. No single, Indian nation. Instead, hundreds of independent indigenous nations living side by side, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. 2. Indigenous governments today, yes, they still exist. Indigenous nations are not just history, they are still active political systems today. What is a tribe today? In the United States, many indigenous groups are federally recognized sovereign nations. That means they have their own governments within the U.S. system. How they govern themselves. Most modern tribal governments include elected tribal council, tribal chairman or president, courts, tribal law system, police, tribal law enforcement. They handle education programs, healthcare systems, housing, land management, cultural preservation. Example, Hopi government. Governed by a tribal council. Villages still maintain traditional leadership roles. Ceremonies and cultural systems remain active. Sovereignty, very important. Tribes are considered domestic dependent nations under U.S. law. That means they are not states. But they are not just regular communities either. They have legal authority over certain lands and laws. Big picture summary. Before colonization, indigenous nations controlled all land. Complex societies existed in every region. California equals diverse village networks. Arizona equals desert farming plus spiritual systems. Texas equals mixed hunting plus trade societies. Today, indigenous nations still exist. They have governments and laws. They maintain culture and identity. They are legally recognized sovereign groups. Indigenous nations were never erased, they were changed by colonization, but they still exist. Today as living governments, cultures, and communities across the Americas. Tribe by tribe breakdown, CA/AZ/TX. These are not all tribes in existence, but key examples so you understand how different each region was. Arizona, Desert Southwest. Hopi tribe. Mesa top villages, some continuously inhabited for 1,000 plus years. Dry farming, corn, beans, squash. Strong ceremonial cycles tied to rain and seasons. Clan-based society, family/clan identity is very important. Navajo Dine. Largest federally recognized tribe in the U.S. Shepherding, sheep, goats. Rug weaving tradition. Government includes council plus president system today. Apache groups. Highly mobile, adapted to mountain/desert. strong warrior/hunting traditions, deep knowledge of terrain and survival. California, most diverse indigenous region. California had 100 plus distinct indigenous nations, not one culture. Coastal tribes, example, Chumash. Ocean fishing, canoe building. Trade networks using shell beads, currency system. Complex religious ceremonies tied to ocean cycles. Inland tribes, example, Miwok Yokuts. Acorn-based diet, oak tree processing systems. Seasonal village movement. Highly sustainable land management, controlled burns. California was one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse regions on Earth. Texas, plains, desert, coastal mix. Texas had 3 main lifestyle zones. Plains tribes, example, Comanche. Buffalo hunting societies. Horse culture after Spanish arrival. Highly mobile warrior economies. Coastal tribes, Karankawa, Coahuiltecan groups. Fishing, shellfish, coastal trading. Small, flexible band societies. Desert groups. Seasonal migration. Hunting plus gathering adapted to dry environments. 2. How indigenous governments work today. Indigenous nations are still active political systems in the U.S. They are called sovereign tribal governments. What sovereign means? A sovereign tribe has its own laws, governs its own citizens, manages some of its own land, but also exists within the U.S. system. How they are structured. Most modern tribes have elected leadership, tribal council, like a parliament, tribal president or chairman, legal systems, tribal courts, tribal law enforcement, public services, schools, healthcare clinics, housing programs, cultural preservation offices. Example, Hopi government. Village-based leadership system still exists. Traditional leaders plus modern elected council both play roles. Ceremonial life still central to governance and identity. Important legal fact. In U.S. law, tribes are domestic dependent nations, meaning not states, not foreign countries, but recognized governments with authority over internal matters. 3. Hopi creation story, spiritual foundation. Core belief system. Life is a journey of balance. Humans must live in harmony with nature. Creation concept, simplified accurately. Hopi oral tradition teaches. Life began in earlier worlds before this one. Humanity moved through stages of learning. Each world ended when people lost balance with nature. The current world is the 4th world. Purpose of life. Live peacefully. Respect nature. Maintain balance. Spiritual beings. Kachinas, spirit messengers representing rain, life, and moral teaching. Ancestors are still spiritually connected to the living world. Key idea. If humans live correctly, nature stays balanced, rain, crops, survival. Final big picture. Before colonization. Hundreds of indigenous nations across North America. Different governments, languages, and economies. Advanced farming, engineering, astronomy, trade. Today, indigenous nations still exist as governments. They manage land, law, education, and culture. Traditions and ceremonies are still alive. Spiritual core, Hopi example. Life equals balance with nature. Humans equals caretakers, not owners. Ancestors plus nature are part of daily life. Indigenous nations were not erased. They were disrupted by colonization, but they remain living governments and cultures with deep spiritual systems still active today. Chapter 6. How colonization actually happened. 1. Before colonization. Before Europeans arrived, the Americas were already full of Indigenous nations. Cities, farms, trade networks, governments, and spiritual systems. Examples: Maya civilization, Aztec Empire, Hopi tribe. There were no U.S., Mexico, Texas, or California borders yet. 2. First contact, 1492 onward, the major turning point was Christopher Columbus voyage 1492. This began European exploration, mapping of the Americas, colonization competition between Spain, Portugal, later England, and France. 3. What colonization means. Colonization is when a foreign power takes control of land, sets up its own government, changes laws, language, and religion, controls resources and labor. 5. Religion during colonization. European colonizers spread Christianity. How it happened. Missions were built. Indigenous people were often pressured or forced to convert. Some adopted Christianity fully. Others blended it with traditional beliefs. This created mixed spiritual systems in many regions. 6. Big impacts of colonization. Population collapse. Disease, smallpox, etc., had massive impact because indigenous peoples had no immunity. Land loss. Land was taken through war, treaties, and colonization systems. Cultural disruption. Some languages and traditions were lost or weakened. Others survived through oral tradition. Force systems. Labor systems and colonial governments replaced many indigenous structures. 7. After Spain, new countries form. When Spain lost control, Mexico became independent in 1821. U.S. expanded westward later. This led to major conflicts over land, including Mexican-American War. After this war, U.S. gained large territories, California, Arizona, Texas region, etc. 8. Did indigenous culture survive? Yes, this is very important. Despite colonization, many nations survived. Languages survived. Ceremonies survived. Governments still exist today. Example: Hopi tribe still maintains cultural and spiritual traditions today. 9. Real truth summary. Colonization equals European takeover of existing indigenous lands. It involved war, treaties, missions, and cultural change. Indigenous populations were deeply impacted but not erased. Modern borders came after colonization, not before. Indigenous nations still exist today as living governments. Colonization was not the discovery of empty land, it was the takeover of already established civilizations, followed by centuries of cultural change, resistance, and survival. How many indigenous people died after colonization? After 1492 and European contact, indigenous populations in the Americas declined massively due to disease, main cause, war and violence, forced labor systems, displacement, and famine. Estimated total impact, Americas overall. Before contact, approximate 50 to 100 million indigenous people across the Americas, estimate range. After centuries of colonization, population dropped by 50% to over 90% in many regions. Main cause, disease. The biggest factor was not just war, it was disease introduced by Europeans. Smallpox, measles, influenza. These spread rapidly because indigenous peoples had no prior immunity. In many regions, disease caused the majority of deaths, often 70 to 90%. War plus violence, regional, examples. Conquest of the Aztec Empire. Inca Empire conquest. Frontier wars in North America. Forced labor systems in Spanish colonies. These added significant additional deaths but were generally less than disease overall. Central America, Maya and Aztec regions. Massive population collapse after Spanish conquest. Some areas lost over 80 to 90% of population within 100 to 200 years. North America, including Hopi region. In what is now the United States, indigenous population dropped from an estimated 5 to 10 million pre-contact to about 250,000 to 500,000 by the 1800s. Simple summary. Across the Americas, millions to tens of millions died total. Most deaths were from disease. Some regions lost nearly entire populations. Others survived and rebuilt communities over time. Important truth. This was not one single event, it happened over 300 plus years. Different regions were affected differently. Many indigenous nations still exist today despite the collapse. Colonization caused one of the largest population declines in human history in the Americas, primarily due to disease, followed by war, force systems, and displacement, but indigenous peoples survived and continue to exist today. How specific tribes survived: Hopi, Navajo, etc. Hopi tribe, survival strategy. Why they survived. The Hopi lived in remote mesa villages in northeastern Arizona. That geography helped because hard to reach by outsiders. Naturally defensive high cliffs. Limited water equals fewer large-scale invasions. Food independence. They survived through dry farming, corn, beans, squash. Storing food for long periods. Adapting crops to desert conditions. Social system. Village-based governance, no single central capital to destroy. Clan system, distributed leadership. Strong oral traditions to preserve identity. Resistance strategy. Often avoided direct large-scale warfare. Maintained independence through isolation plus negotiation. Result: Hopi culture remained continuous for centuries, even under pressure. Navajo, Dian, adaptation plus resistance. The Navajo are one of the largest indigenous nations today. Geography advantage. Lived in mountains, canyons, and vast desert areas. Terrain made full control difficult for outside forces. Economic adaptation. Adopted sheep herding, introduced later, but mastered it. Weeding became major cultural and economic practice. Conflict plus survival. Did resist colonization militarily at times. Also adapted by moving and rebuilding communities. Cultural strength. Strong language preservation. Clan-based identity system still active today. 2. How indigenous nations still govern today. Despite colonization, many native nations never disappeared, they adapted into modern governments. What? Modern tribal government means. Today, federally recognized tribes in the U.S. are sovereign governments within the U.S. system. Elected leadership. Tribal council, like a parliament or Congress. Tribal chairman/president. Legal system. Tribal courts. Tribal laws separate from state law in many cases. Public services. Tribal police. Schools. Healthcare systems. Housing programs. Example: Hopi governance today. Village leadership structure, traditional system still active. Tribal council, modern government layer. Ceremonial leadership, spiritual/cultural authority still important. So they have both traditional plus modern governance systems working together. Navajo Nation today. Largest native nation in the U.S. Has its own president and council. Runs its own services across a large territory spanning multiple states they manage. Schools. Police. Natural resources. Courts. 3. Big idea: how they recovered. Important truth: they didn't recover like nothing happened. They 1. Adapted. Changed economic systems, sheep, trade, modern jobs. 2. Preserved governance. Kept leadership systems alive, even if forced underground at times. 3. Protected language plus ceremony. Oral tradition kept knowledge alive. Ceremonies continued in secret during suppression periods. 4. Used modern law. Gained federal recognition in the U.S. Now operate as legal sovereign nations. Final truth. Many tribes survived because of geography, adaptation, and cultural resilience. Some avoided destruction by being remote or mobile. Others endured through resistance and rebuilding. Today, indigenous nations are still active governments, not historical remnants. Indigenous nations were not erased. They survived through adaptation, resistance, and continuity, and today they still exist as living governments with ancient roots and modern authority. Chapter 7: Indian Boarding Schools, U.S. and Canada. What they were. Starting in the late 1800s, the U.S. government and churches created boarding schools for Native children. One of the most well-known examples was Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded 1879. The system expanded across the United States and Canada. 1. The goal of boarding schools. Officially, they were said to educate indigenous children, teach English and trades. But the real policy goal was forced assimilation. That means removing indigenous identity, replacing it with European American culture. 2. What happened to children? Children were often taken from families, sometimes forcibly, sent far away from their communities, not allowed to return for years. Cultural suppression. In many schools, native languages were banned. Traditional clothing was taken away. Hair was cut, very symbolic in many cultures. Indigenous names were replaced with English names. Religious pressure. Many schools were run by churches and promoted Christianity. Children were often required to attend church services, discouraged or punished for practicing traditional beliefs. Labor system. Many children worked long hours, farming, cleaning, maintenance. Received limited formal education compared to stated goals. 3. Impact on native nations. Language loss. Many indigenous languages were severely weakened. Some became endangered or nearly lost. Family disruption. Separation from parents broke cultural teaching chains. Parenting knowledge was interrupted across generations. Trauma. Many survivors reported emotional and psychological trauma. Effects continued into later generations, intergenerational trauma. Cultural damage, but not destruction. Ceremonies, languages, and traditions still survived in many communities. Families worked hard to preserve identity in secret or at home. 4. Was this only in the U.S.? No, it also happened in Canada, residential school system. Parts of Australia, similar assimilation policies. 5. How native nations responded. Despite this system, indigenous nations continued practicing ceremonies in private, preserved languages and families, rebuilt tribal governments later, fought for recognition and rights in courts and politics. Example: Hopi tribe maintained ceremonies and clan systems even during outside pressure. 6. Modern recognition. Today, governments in the U.S. and Canada officially acknowledge the harms. Investigations and reports have documented the system's impacts. Tribes continue cultural and legal restoration efforts. Big Truths Summary. Boarding schools were part of a forced assimilation system. Children were separated from families and cultures. Languages and traditions were suppressed. The impact is still felt today. but indigenous nations survived and continue rebuilding. Boarding schools were designed to erase indigenous identity, but instead they created deep disruption and also strengthened indigenous determination to preserve language, culture, and sovereignty for future generations. Final conclusion. Boarding schools, U.S. and Canada. From the 1800s, 1900s, governments and churches ran boarding schools like Carlisle Indian Industrial School. What happened? Indigenous children were taken from families, sometimes forcibly. Languages and traditions were banned. Children were forced into European-style education and religion. Many suffered abuse, neglect, and harsh conditions. Deaths and burial sites, what is documented? Investigations have confirmed. At least 973 indigenous children died in U.S. federal boarding schools, confirmed government investigation. Some studies estimate 3,000 plus deaths total across the system in later research. Graves, marked and unmarked, have been found at multiple school sites. In Canada, similar residential school systems also found graves and unmarked burial sites, including over 200 children at one site discovery. Important truth: many children were buried near schools or in school cemeteries. Records are incomplete, so exact totals are still being investigated. Why this is taught less in history books? It's not that it is completely erased, but historically it was undertaught because early history books were written from colonial perspectives. Focus was placed on European expansion and nation building. Indigenous oral history was not treated equally in academic systems. Now changing. Modern textbooks include more indigenous history. Governments have released official investigations. Tribes are actively documenting their own history. Colonization, big picture. Colonization in the Americas involved land transfer through war, treaties, and settlement. Spread of European governments, languages, and religion. Major population loss, mostly from disease, not just ICT. Cultural disruption and forced assimilation in some eras. Important balance, this is key. What is true? Indigenous peoples had advanced civilizations and governments. Boarding schools caused major cultural harm and deaths. Indigenous history was often minimized in mainstream education. Many graves and burial sites connected to schools have been confirmed. What is also true? Not all indigenous history was erased, much survived through oral tradition and modern scholarship. Colonization did not happen the same way everywhere. Most deaths in early contact periods were from disease, not mass burial systems. Final truth summary. Indigenous nations existed long before colonization. Had governments, science, spirituality, and culture. Were deeply impacted by colonization and boarding schools. Survived through resistance, adaptation, and preservation. Boarding schools were a system of forced assimilation. Caused cultural loss and confirmed deaths. Left long-term trauma still studied today. Indigenous history was not erased, it was disrupted, undertaught, and reshaped through colonization, but it still survives today in living nations, languages, and governments. Chapter 8: How Tribes Are Reclaiming Land and Rights Today. 1. Who took the land, historically? Different powers controlled indigenous land at different times. But indigenous nations were already living there before all of these governments existed. 2. What reclaiming rights means today. Modern tribes are not usually getting all land back. Instead, they are reclaiming land rights, specific areas, water rights, hunting/fishing rights, legal sovereignty, cultural protection, financial compensation in some cases. 3. How they do it. Modern courts. Tribes use U.S. federal courts, lawsuits against state or federal governments. Treaties. Old agreements between tribes and the U.S. government are legally binding today. Many cases are based on broken treaties, land agreements, sovereignty violations. 4. Examples of land/rights being restored. Water rights, very common. Tribes have won legal recognition of river access, groundwater rights, irrigation rights, fishing and hunting rights. Some tribes regained salmon fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest. Hunting access on traditional lands. Land returns, smaller but growing. Some land has been returned through federal agreements, state partnerships, conservation transfers. Example trend: land trusts returning sacred or ancestral areas to tribes. 5. What sovereignty means today. Most federally recognized tribes are sovereign governments inside the United States. That means they can pass laws, run courts, operate police forces, manage schools and healthcare systems. Example: Hopi tribe maintains both traditional leadership and modern tribal government systems. 6. Important reality: what tribes are doing. Protecting what remains, restoring rights to legal systems, preserving culture and language, negotiating land and resource agreements. What is harder? Full return of all ancestral land is rare. Legal process is slow and complex. Governments and states also have legal claims now. 7. Big picture. Land changed hands through Spain, Mexico, United States, and many regions. Indigenous nations were never legally gone, but their control was reduced. Today they use courts and treaties to regain rights step by step. Progress is ongoing, not finished. Modern indigenous nations are not only preserving culture, they are actively using law,